Hi, Elaine here. In our first teaser episode, the day after Kamala lost, Carlin and I discussed our feelings on the November 2024 elections. It's been 7 months since that initial talk, and a lot has happened. Trump was sworn in, and so much followed. Tariff wars, increased ICE deportations, measles outbreaks, Doge, and more. I admit I did not do well in the first couple months of Trump's second presidency. When Carlin came and visited in early May, I was struck by how differently we seem to be experiencing the political fallout. And since we are 6 months into the term, I wanted to check in with Carlin to see how she's feeling. Unlike our normal episodes, we did no prior readings because I wanted to focus on how we're processing current events. Again, I'm Elaine.
And I'm Carlin.
Welcome back to our podcast, Related. So, Carlin, you know I've always been fascinated by politics and have paid pretty close attention to them since at least high school.
Yes.
Would you call yourself political?
No. I was going to... I would... well, I was thinking without having... So for context for listeners, Elaine gave me very zero little prep for this episode, as she mentioned. And also, I didn't even know what questions she was going to ask until maybe 30 seconds a minute ago. And as I was reading the first question that you just asked me, and also just as you read it to me, honestly, my first gut instinct is no. And I don't know if that's also potentially in contrast to you, mom and dad, and Strand, our brother, as well, who I think are very, very political and political minded, well-read. I mean, I don't know if it's the fact that you're lawyers. Mom's also a constitutional lawyer too. So there are, but my gut instinct was no. And I'm happy to dig into that.
Well, I just want to correct something you said, because you said well-read, like you aren't well-read, because you are incredibly well-read.
Sorry. Yes, I am well-read, but I think, I mean, I don't follow politics, I think, to the more granular level that the rest of our family does.
Is it just politics that you don't follow the news, or do you just not follow news in general?
I do follow news. I don't digest and thoroughly read the news. Okay, so I mean, granted, we're millennials, so we grew up in the physical newspaper age, right? Where dad especially would always get his multiple newspapers and gradually read through every single section, right? So you have world, you have local, you have domestic, state, you have culture, you have comics, right? So when I think about it in the context of that, I think like, wow, I love the travel section. I love the culture section. I love the comics. But was I the one, and I would do maybe a quick like high level of what are the big conflicts happening in the world, natural disasters, what are the things that I need and should know about.
Yeah.
But do I go deep on those things? No, I find myself gravitating towards, editorial columns on the latest book that's come out, or a comparison of, trends in reality TV to the typical like HBO drama era. Or honestly, a lot of like, I do love people. So I love people-driven stories.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, when it comes to politics specifically, I'm like, okay, I know the high level. I know what's going on. I will say, honestly, probably in the past, since Trump honestly was elected, I am more engaged and fluent in politics than perhaps I was before. But it is not, I don't have the same interest or passion for it. And I have some guilt and shame around that too, which we could dig into. But I do not follow politics the way the rest of our family does. I don't think.
So compared to us, you're saying
Yes.
you're not political. Compared
Yes.
to like your peers and your friends, would you consider yourself more political or less political?
That's a good question. Many of them I would, well, and I think it's also important to level set around who a lot of the people I spend time with are. It tends to be a lot of sort of liberal minded folks, a lot of very academically also well read folks.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I just came back. We were just talking about this before hopping on the podcast. I just came back from the Bay Area, where I actually feel like when I'm in the Bay Area, I spend more time talking just about what's going on in the world more generally, maybe less so about politics in the sense of, Trump.
The formal, yes.
Right, the
Yeah.
formal, but just it does feel like we're a little less inward and a little bit more what's happening in San Francisco, what is the homelessness problem? And I think also a lot of my friends there are actually actively working to solve those problems as part of their careers. While as in Los Angeles, my friends I think they care as much about the world, but it is a little bit more insular and there's not as much talk about it. There's a lot more talk about entertainment and the sort of so-called superficial stuff, I would say. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I feel like I'm going on a little bit of a tangent.
No, but I'm curious to dig into why you think that is, not as a judgment of the people who are having those experiences, but maybe about the different landscapes between LA and the Bay Area. I wonder if it's because in LA there's like a more strict divide between people who are well off and people who aren't, or
I don't know. I'm just going back to your question too around how do I think I compare to the sort of people that I'm interacting most with on a day-to-day basis. I think my answer is honestly compared to a lot of the people. So I think about my business partner, for example, who lives in Utah, but also former Bay Area. She is very politically minded and reads news. And honestly, I'm often getting a lot of my news from her, the same way that I'm also getting news from you and Mom and Dad and Strand, right? And so compared to her, I feel like, wow, I really don't feel all that politically sort of in tune to some of the day-to-day, like minute by minute nuances. However, I listen to the Daily every single morning.
Yeah.
I get my news from my family and from my business partner. And I will say, compared to other people, especially here in LA that I interact with, I do feel, I think, more in tune maybe to sort of some of what's going on. But I don't know. I also, again, I'm using points of comparison. My amazing 90-year-old neighbor, who granted is not very mobile these days, so she spends a lot of her time watching CNN, is very in tune with the news and the landscape. Right. And so every time I see her, she's depressed. She's, like bewildered by what's going on in the world. While as, I just saw a hummingbird and I'm like, oh, look at that hummingbird, so but again, there is some shame and some guilt in it for me that I feel a little bit more distance from the day-to-day, minute by minute, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the reason, though, that I wanted to talk to you about this is what you kind of just touched on is I have been really immersed in politics, and it has really affected my mood in the past 6 months. I feel like every morning I get up, I take a look at the news, and it just feels like it's a weight that I cannot get rid of. Mm. So we've established kind of how you follow the news. Mm-hmm. Has that changed in the last 6 months? Do you think you pay more attention, less attention than you did before?
So I remember during Trump's presidency, I stopped listening to the Daily because every single day was another thing about Trump.
Sorry, and the first presidency or
the first
president?
No, the first presidency. I'm sharing this for context.
Yeah.
During his first presidency, I couldn't listen to the Daily every day because it was just more Trump stuff. It would make me feel angry, sad, like whatever it was. And so I just kind of stopped listening. And I set, I think, more of a boundary to myself of this is actually negatively impacting some of my
Yeah.
mental health. And so, okay, here's the boundary. This presidency, for whatever reason, and I don't know if it's the Daily is scattering a little sort of, I don't know, we talked about the Iran stuff, which is still Trump related. There was an
But it's
episode
not,
recently.
yeah.
Yeah. But I'm like, okay, I need to know what's happening, because I do feel like, again, I feel like other people are better to speak to this, but I do feel like we're on the edge of crisis or in crisis or whatnot. And so I do want to know what's going on, but the boundary, what I am capable of, right, without it, I think ruining my day is 30 minutes of the Daily every morning. And that's about it. But I know I'm actually really curious. We've never talked about this. What does news consumption look like for you?
So I'm pretty news oriented. I get up and take a quick look at, like, I have the Apple News that aggregates from various websites. So I take a look at that. And if there's like something new that I hadn't heard of, I'll take a quick scan of an article. I wouldn't say it's like a deep dive. It's just kind of keeping up with the news.
Yeah.
In so much as I just want to be informed. But I think also by living next to DC, there's also more ways to kind of, the news kind of seeps in.
Yeah.
If you go out and about, like, you hear people talking, you hear buzzwords, and you're like, oh, what's that? I want to know what's going on with that. You see, I'm a Reddit person. So if I'm going on in the DC or Nova Reddits, like, people are talking about things that are happening in the streets. There have been quite a few protests since Trump was inaugurated, and a lot of them have happened in DC, and so people are like looking for where to go and things like that.
Yep.
So it kind of just seeps in, I think, in a more natural way than it probably does in LA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess a follow-up question would be, are you passionate about politics? Do you there's news, right? And then there's politics. What is your driver, I guess, to stay so on top of all of that?
Yeah.
Beyond sort of obviously living in DC and kind of being inundated and naturally surrounded by it.
Yeah.
Is there a personal driver for you to both interest? I'm just curious to understand, because I sometimes wonder, I'm like, where is that missing for me too?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it boils down to is I have always just been fascinated by how people decide to live together.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes back to my sociology. Was my major in college, and I'm just fascinated by how humans interact as a whole. And politics is our social contract. This is how we're going to deal with each other, and for good or bad, this is the mechanism that we've chosen. And I find that fascinating.
Yep.
And so I think even prior to Trump gaining power or momentum, even I've always been interested in politics. Like, I remember canvassing for Obama. So I've always been fascinated by that aspect. Like, how have we decided that we want to interact with each other? Yeah. So I think for me, it comes out of that.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because I'm not interested in those things, right? I would actually say that I'm also really interested in people, but maybe more on the emotional side versus sort of the structural, contractual side. Like, I think about the ways that I am moved to engage with the world, and it's things like grief camp, right? Or the foster system, for example, right? Which are maybe inherently, I think there might be other people who would say, well, there are politics involved. But I think the way that I have naturally been drawn to engage on a local or domestic level is through more like human to human emotional.
Yeah. And I actually think that there has been this divide where, like, in my mind, I would actually call that politics. I
Yeah.
think there's
Yeah.
been this
Yeah.
divide between macro and micro
Yeah.
politics, where people look at macro politics and say,
And how would you
like, that's
define those two?
politics. I think macro politics, and I don't want to just divide it between like
Yeah.
national
Yeah.
and local.
Yeah.
I think it's like more big policy changes that you don't see impacting your day-to-day
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
versus things that you do feel the immediate impact of.
Yeah.
And I think people have divided those, and they've labeled the macro as politics
Mm.
and not really seen the micro as also being political.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people that are involved in micro politics often dismiss politics, the term,
Yeah.
because they don't see that impacting the micro.
Yeah. I would also say, and maybe this is where I disengage with so-called politics, frankly, on either a macro or a micro level, is like politicians are just not a construct that I've ever really resonated with. And so even on a city, local, neighborhood level, right? It's just sort of, I think in theory, the idea of representation and law and whatnot all makes sense to me. But how the politicians currently structure within politics, sort of, I think where the representation piece has come to at this point doesn't actually always feel representative, right?
Yeah.
And so,
No, absolutely.
yeah. And so I think it's interesting. I'm having this realization as I'm talking to you, is that's the part of politics where I just kind of, I don't engage. Like, I don't know. I'm not as familiar, frankly, even with my California senators or, Karen Bass, our mayor. I'm not as familiar with that level of politics, or that, if whatever you call it. But I am engaged with, say, homelessness or the foster. I mentioned the foster system too. So that's interesting. So yeah.
No, and I think to me that is actually very political.
Yeah.
I also don't think I resonate with politicians.
Yeah.
I think it's on a whole, I don't feel like I am represented by representatives.
Yeah.
Are there examples that you can think of where you're like, oh, there's an exception? Like, I really like him, her, they just, I mean,
yeah.
Is anybody speaking to you like anywhere in the world?
I mean, not really, if I'm honest. There's no, I think when I think of sort of the leaders and the humans that are speaking to me, and I'm not saying that all politics are bad people by any means. I just think that a lot of the structures in which politicians are currently moving and the way that they're elected and, very capitalist, sort of through funding and money, and then just the politics of it all too. I think about it even in taking politics side about it, but even in corporate tech, tech worlds where I've gone, like the politics of people trying to get things done and bureaucracy, that's always been a turn off to me too. So, I don't know, that those structures are inherently, I think, kind of really frustrating to me. And so, for better or for worse, I think my tendency is to sort of say, okay, I just kind of don't fuck with them. So when I think of leaders or humans that I think are doing a lot of good for the world, it's actually people who aren't politicians. So, this is actually very interesting. I'm having all these realizations sort of as we're talking. Is maybe I am, from an external perspective, a lot of what I do is inherently political, but it is some sort of the typical what we call politics and frankly politicians. I think like politicians and lawmakers that I don't follow that, frankly, because I think a lot of it is ineffective right now.
Yeah.
And I find that a lot of the effectiveness is happening on a more human to human level.
Yeah. I also, it's funny because though I follow politics, I also think politics has become increasingly ineffective.
Yeah.
I asked it as a neutral question because I didn't want to introduce my own biases. But how do you feel like people like Bernie Sanders or AOC or Memdani?
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. I actually, so I'm going to take Bernie and AOC sort of out of the equation a little bit because I actually think even though they're very outspoken and they've been doing this roadshow, they're still part of the political structures for better, for worse. And what's really interesting about Mamdani is that he's fresh blood and he's making a stance and he's running for office, obviously, but he's not yet in it, right? So, so I think there's a piece where I, honestly also too, I've been really fascinated by his branding. Like the logo and the design is really interesting to me. And it's very clear how he's showing up differently. And yeah, I'm just kind of over left, right politics. I'm just kind of over it. And I think a lot of people are. And I think what's really interesting about Mamdani is the fresh perspective, a very human perspective. But I'll be super honest, I'm not feeling particularly optimistic because I'm sort of thinking, well, once you're elected and within the structures,
right,
that is what it is. So I don't know. I think I may be giving off more of a pessimistic view than I actually feel. I think, and you had mentioned kind of waking up, just feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders a lot. I think I feel that weight sometimes too, but I think I actually feel more optimistic because I see a lot of humans doing good and taking care of each other. And I think I'm paying more attention to that right now, frankly, than I am to the quote politics of it all, where I think people are really not taking care of each other at all.
Yeah. So one last question before I move on to like LA.
Yeah.
But you vote regularly.
Yep.
So what keeps you voting if you don't believe in the kind of structure of it all?
I mean, well,
is it just obligation?
It is some obligation. And, when other people tell me they don't vote, I'm like, what a waste of your constitutional right. And I don't want it to come off as I've completely given up on our government systems. But I will also say, when I vote in my local elections, for example, or state elections, I am not super, super well versed. I say this again with a little bit of guilt and shame. I usually will read the LA Times or the San Francisco Chronicle to sort of get a high level perspective on what people are representing and vote accordingly. But I'm not necessarily doing a ton of that research on my own or tuning into the individual candidates. I'm not to the point where I'm like, my vote is meaningless.
Right.
But am I voting with passion? No. And honestly, I think the last time I voted with passion was my first presidential vote for Barack Obama.
And what was it about that you think clicked?
Honestly, the fact that he was a biracial man was a big piece of it. And I on a more generic, broader level resonated with the sort of messages around change and hope. But for me, it was more, again, the human side of progress of this is a biracial man, as a biracial woman. There is a lot that I see of my experience in this man, and also to feel more represented in that capacity. And what it also represented to, like I remember Mama's reaction, for example, when he was running and was elected was I just never thought I would see a
Right.
Black president. Like that to me is really important. Again, I'm saying this. I don't know why I have so much shame and guilt around this, but that was where a lot of that sentiment was coming for me.
Yeah. So I do want to turn to LA
Yeah.
because LA has recently been going through some
Yeah,
stuff.
we have had a year, folks. Yeah, yeah.
Specifically on the ICE protests in LA.
Mhm.
Has that touched you in any way? How has that affected your day-to-day life, if at all?
Yeah.
Because I think we touched upon this idea of like distance from the issues.
Yeah.
And this is an issue that maybe was more ephemeral that has really come down to the streets in LA.
Yeah. And I will also say too, we had the fires earlier this year, which was maybe not political on a national level, but if we're using sort of this newer term of how we define politics, was very political, right?
Yeah. But also touches on like
climate change
if you're
like
looking at a bigger picture. Yeah.
And so I guess the reason I bring that up is I was engaging with LA, I think, in a different way. And, there weren't protests per se, right? But there were volunteer banks and, I had friends and old colleagues who lost their homes. And I would go to Quaker meeting, there were people there who lost their homes. We would talk about it. So, and I think what was really compelling about it is, yes, other people were hearing about it more broadly. And this was also kind of around the same time that Trump was being inaugurated, was that it literally felt like our city was on fire.
It was on fire. Yeah.
Was on fire. But also people were taking care of each other too during it. So there was while the global national political stage was starting to blow up, our city was actually in some ways kind of looking inwards, but also on fire, but also kind of taking care of each other too. Again, more on like a human to human, neighbor to neighbor. With ICE stuff, yes, I will say it's very present right now here in LA. My gardener, to be clear, I live in a rented flat. My landlord has a landscape team that comes by every week. The lead gardener has not come by for the past 3 weeks because he's worried about the ICE raids. My cleaning lady recently asked me if I would start paying her in cash just because, and she's from Guatemala. She's documented, but she's just going, I think, a little bit more off the radar to the extent that she can. My 90-year-old neighbor, who I love dearly, is a white woman, Canadian, but she's on a green card. She's not a U.S. citizen. She, every time I see her, is worried about getting deported. And I'm like, I don't think you are the target right now. But again, I think there are a lot of people just living in fear right now. On the flip side, I will say to be in a place like Los Angeles where the undocumented community is such a big part of who we are, and I think so appreciated and loved. So, when ICE is trying to raid the local Costco's closing its doors. And that's not to say that ICE isn't present, but there's a bigger sense of solidarity, I think, here of protecting our people to the extent that we can, in a way that's maybe not present in other parts of the state. So, but to your point, I think it took something that has been more on sort of a national level, and it's feeling very micro and very local. And so I'm seeing, let's just put it this way, the things that like you and mom and dad are thinking about from it, living in DC, are things that I'm also thinking about right now living in LA, because there's such that local presence. While as, when I visited in May and you guys were talking about some of the constitutional sort of Supreme Court decisions and whatnot, I'm like, wow, I am so far removed from this, even though it impacts me just as much as it does you, right? But so with ICE in particular, I'm feeling it more on a day-to-day basis. But again, my engagement with it is more on a neighborhood level than it is on, quote, political, I'm doing quotation marks now, political level.
Yeah. I do think that there should be a caveat that being a lawyer means you're basically trained in.
Yes, and the fact that you, mom, and dad are all lawyers. Yes.
Yes. So when we have conversations, there's
To be clear, so I was home and we had a dinner with Elaine, our mom and dad, and then our other two family friends, one of whom is also a lawyer and another who's also just married to a lawyer and like deeply embedded in sort of the political landscape right now. And I was like, wow, I ping-ponging opinions and I'm just like, yeah, LA's hot right now. So yeah.
And I do think that there is a disconnect between politicians and the people who talk about politics, quote unquote, and the people who are enacting actual policies, like people on the ground.
Yeah. But I do think it is really fascinating how differently we've experienced the past 6 months. And I do think, to your point, some of it is you living truly in the epicenter of where a lot of the lawmaking and decision-making is happening right now. And I do think I live, and I'm very privileged to live in a state generally that is, can be, you know, is a super large economy in and of itself.
Yeah.
Has a governor right now that is very actively standing up to the president. And I think when you live in California, for better or for worse, you kind of like, I'm going to be okay. And I remember thinking that actually, especially with the Roe v. Wade overturn, which I know was a while ago, but kind of thinking, well, I'm in California, so generally I'm going to be okay, right? And that is also not a great feeling to have when you're like, I live in this bubble and the states potentially around me are falling apart. And I'm also, I don't want to make it seem like California doesn't also have its nuances and complexities and political divides, but we are more protected, I think, on a state level than other states are, or other people, especially in underrepresented groups, women, trans people who live in other places, especially redder states. They're not protected the way that people in our state are. So I think I have a privilege of sort of knowing that and living that. And I think Californians could, frankly, I speak for myself, could be better at, frankly, enabling the power that we do have and the privilege we have to helping and pushing more.
So that covers my questions. Is there anything that we talked about that you want to reiterate or?
Yeah, I mean,
ask me.
I remember sending it to the family chat after the No Kings protest. I think I am still trying to figure out the best way to engage. And I think in some ways this conversation has affirmed that I am engaging, maybe just in different ways.
You are engaging, yeah.
But I don't love huge crowds. So I think protests have not always been the way that I naturally sort of say, this is how I want to get back, or get out or show support. But I am worried about sort of the state and the future of our country. So I'm just trying to figure out what the balance is of how to do that, and also, frankly, maintain my optimism too. Because I do think people are good at the end of the day. And I think people want to be kind to their neighbors at the end of the day. And I just don't really know the best way to bring that sentiment or bridge that sentiment, because I think so many people are feeling it regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum.
Yeah. And on the other side, I think politicians need to do a better job of connecting with people who are actually doing the work.
Yeah.
And are in these communities and are in these neighborhoods, and there's a disconnect.
I guess One question I do have for you, which is, you mentioned sort of the first couple months you were really feeling post-election, post-inauguration, we were really feeling the weight. How are you feeling now?
I'm feeling better.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I think actually because I've started getting involved. So I had done the protests, but I recently connected with some people who are doing some organizing in Virginia.
Yeah.
And I'm getting more involved with that. And I also started this newsletter, which is a little cathartic, and just getting my thoughts out there.
Seeking Democracy on Substack. Everyone should subscribe.
I'm just, I'm making moves.
Yeah.
And I'm not just discussing politics anymore. I'm trying to figure out what the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say one thing that was interesting about being back in DC and listening to a bunch of lawyers talk about the state of our Constitution was I don't think I had realized how in crisis we were legally. And I don't think the majority of the country, frankly, has the expertise or the knowledge or the wherewithal to really know that. It's one thing when you get the media sort of saying constitutional crisis, right?
Right.
It's another when you have people you've known and trusted and loved for all of your life who are actually erudite and skilled in legal constitutional law talking through those risks and complications, right? So I don't know. I also just think we have a media problem, which could be its whole other.
Yeah, we definitely have a media problem.
We have a media
Don't
problem.
get me started.
Yeah. So yeah, but it's been really interesting to see how we're experiencing things really differently right now.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our conversation today, we look forward to sharing more with you.
Follow us now so that when our next episode premieres, you can be sure not to miss it. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
See you next time, everyone.